A few days after the San Marino Grand Prix, there were local council elections in England and Scotland. As always, while in theory people were electing their local councillors, in practice it was treated by the media as a referendum on the national government in Westminster, and the results did not make pretty reading for John Major, with the Conservatives ending the day 516 councillors lighter, most of which went to the third party, the Liberal Democrats, who picked up 428 seats. A by-election was also held the same day in Rotherham following the death of the Labour MP there, and Dennis McShane held the seat with a substantial minority, but again the Liberal Democrats pushed the Conservatives into a distant third place. But any thoughts that the main opposition Labour Party might have had of benefiting from Major's discomfiture were put on hold when a week later the party's leader John Smith, who'd replaced Neil Kinnock after the 1992 election, suddenly died of a heart attack at just 55. The son of Scottish schoolteachers, he'd served in the last Labour government in the 1970s under Jim Callaghan and had been well known as a clever debater as well as a thoroughly decent chap. He had been an advocate of Scottish devolution and had abolished the trade union block vote in favour of a one-member, one-vote system in determining leadership and policy direction. The Channel Tunnel was officially opened by Queen Elizabeth and President Mitterrand, the Queen travelling through the tunnel in one of the new Eurostar passenger trains, which met nose-to-nose at Calais with the President's train from Paris for the French opening ceremony, and then they all returned to Folkestone on the car carrying Le Shuttle for the British ceremony. The first regular services would start a couple of weeks later with the Le Shuttle service for lorries, followed by freight trains in June. Then the Eurostar London-Paris-Brussels service would begin in November, but the first paying passengers were able to travel through the tunnel more or less immediately. A pair of British Rail Class 319 electric trains had been modified earlier in the year to take dignitaries down for a look, and these were chartered for an immensely popular excursion programme the day after the official ceremony. The Italian Air Force had offered to fly Ayrton Senna's coffin back to Brazil with full military honours, but the family thought that it should be on a Brazilian plane, and an aircraft of national airline Varig was dispatched, along with his brother Leonardo and close friends, to return the great man home. Escorted into Sao Paulo airport by an honour guard of Brazilian fighter jets, it was met by Mayor Paulo Maluf, who'd been so active in promoting the Brazilian Grand Prix at Interlagos, and the coffin was carried the 20 miles into the city itself on a fire engine with an honour guard and 2,500 police deployed along the route to the Legislative Assembly building, where it lay in state overnight, visited by an estimated 200,000 people. The funeral was the following day, a state funeral with all the trappings, a 21-gun salute, Air Force flypast, and uncountable numbers watching from the packed streets as the procession made its way to the Morumbi Cemetery. According to the rules and tradition of the cemetery, Senna's grave was marked only with a simple bronze plaque with his dates, and the epitaph in Portuguese, Nada pode me separar do amor de Deus, translating to, Nothing can separate me from the love of God, Romans 8:38-39. The great and good of the motor racing world assembled in Sao Paulo, with the coffin escorted by a long list of pallbearers. Arriving in the morning, Senna's personal assistant Baptiste Assomption, later Mrs. Patrick Head, was horrified to discover that the organisers had drawn up an order of precedence in terms of racing success, which had left Alain Prost and Jackie Stewart leading the procession. Senna's rivalry with Prost was of course legendary, but he'd also fallen out with Stewart in a big way after the Scot considered the crash at Suzuka in 1990 to have been a deliberate act by Senna. After some quick rearranging, the cortege would now be led by Emerson Fittipaldi and Ayrton's great friend Gerhard Berger, with Prost, Rubens Barrichello, Thierry Boutsen, Christian Fittipaldi, Michele Alboreto, Roberto Moreno, Wilson and Christian Fittipaldi, Pedro Lamy, Mauricio Gugelmin, Derek Warwick, Damon Hill, Raoul Boesel, Hans-Joachim Stuck and Maurizio Sandro Sala, the other pallbearers. Bernie Eccleston had been specifically excluded from the ceremony, as the family was still angry that the race hadn't been stopped, and that Bernie had told Leonardo on his arrival at Imola that Ayrton had died on impact, when in fact he was still alive in hospital at the time. Eccleston instead watched incognito in the street. Ron Dennis, Ken Tyrrell, Frank Williams and Peter Collins were all there, but Senna's friend in the McLaren team, Joe Ramirez, and Sid Watkins were both too distraught to go, as was Martin Brundle, who remembered the funeral of his teammate Stefan Belloff in 1985 all too clearly, though he later said he regretted not going. In all, an estimated 3 million people were present in Sao Paulo to see off Ayrton Senna. In Salzburg 2 days later it was a much quieter affair with just 250 attendees, among them Karl Wendlinger, Heinz-Harald Frentzen and Johnny Herbert, who'd been a friend and rival of Ratzenberger going back to their F3 days in 1985. Max Mosley made a point of attending, knowing that most of the big names would be in Brazil, and Gerhard Berger managed both. A Reddit thread suggests that Murray Walker went as well, but I haven't seen any corroborating evidence of that, so take that for what it's worth. If there are any photographs of Roland's funeral out there in internet land, I haven't been able to find them, but I was in Salzburg on holiday last year and took time out to visit the charming little Maxglan parish church and its peaceful churchyard, where he rests in the family plot, and took a couple of photos after paying my respects. It's worth a trip if you're in the area. Gerhard Berger had considered retiring at the end of 1993 after his terrifying accidents in Monza and Estoril, and having pulled out of the Imola Grand Prix following the tragedies, he'd spent a lot of time thinking about his future in F1. Now the senior driver in the sport, aged 34, the same as Senna and Ratzenberger, with 150 Grand Prix and 8 wins under his belt, it would undoubtedly fall to him to be the father figure to the paddock both morally and also potentially as head of the newly reformed drivers' union, the GPDA. On the 11th of May, he called a press conference in Monaco to confirm that he would not be, as many had speculated, retiring with immediate effect. Quote, "After 10 years in F1, I'm still a young driver. F1 is my life. Give it up? Why? I love racing so much that I can't give up the unique pleasures of driving. I saw Ayrton on his deathbed, but I also saw him during the 3 seasons we spent together at McLaren. Confronting others and himself behind the wheel was what he loved most in the world. It's the same for me." For their part, the FIA called a meeting a couple of days after the Imola race and announced some new safety measures, mainly concerned with safety in the pit lane. An 80 kph speed limit was announced, along with a redesigning of the pit entrance and exit to force cars to slow down. No one was allowed on the tarmac in the pit lane except those actually working on cars at the time, and a draw would be arranged to predetermine the order in which cars would make pit stops, with stops out of that order only for emergencies and with no fuel or tyre changing allowed. Max Mosley stressed in the press conference the importance of not overreacting and making knee-jerk changes that might cause other accidents. The Williams and Simtech teams had both decided to only run 1 car at Monaco, though Frank Williams claimed to have had a dozen drivers making inquiries in the intervening 2 weeks. Clearly, mourning had its limits, while Frank himself asked if Riccardo Patrese would like to fill in, but the Italian wasn't interested under the circumstances. In either case, Damon Hill was now the team leader and focus of much media pressure, and many, both pundits and within the team, wondered if he had what it took to deal with this new role. The team, for their part, were still trying to work out what had gone so wrong at Imola, fitting accelerometers to the wheels to measure chassis performance, and fitting those anti-vortex side skirts behind the wheels to reduce turbulence around the cockpit, an innovation also sponsored by the Benettons. Riccardo Patrese actually was also being talked about as a potential Ligier driver. The sale of the French team had gone through for a mere 50 million francs, compared to the 250 million of sponsorship money guaranteed annually, with the Benetton company owning 65% and the remaining 35% split between Flavio Briatore and Tom Walkinshaw personally. The new owners left manager Bruno Michel in charge, but slashed the staff by 20%, with rumours suggesting that the technical staff would all be for the job, and next year's car designed by Frank Dernier Enstone. Olivier Panis had solid backing from Elf and Gitane, but his teammate Eric Bernard didn't, and Flavio still theoretically owed Riccardo Patrese a year of contract. The machine of F1 rolled onwards, with teams making adjustments to their cars in the hope of increased performance. Tyrrell with some extra fins on the bodywork and a change down 2 gears button on the steering wheel. McLaren with their own power steering, and Minardi tweaking the brakes and suspension. Sauber weren't happy with their engine's pneumatic distribution and went back to their previous one, which meant a slimmer body for the car, which was now also trying out a heat exchanger rather than a radiator to cool the gearbox. And, thanks for mentioning this in the comments, but among all the traumas of Imola, the Pacific team had had what at any other time would be counted as a bad weekend. First, they'd been talking to the Enlightened Tobacco Company about a sponsorship from their primary brand, but after the events at Imola, it was agreed all round that however punk and edgy, maybe having death on the cars so prominently was not, as we would say in 2025, a good look. And then the team's transporters caught fire in the Mont Blanc tunnel on the way home, though they did manage to salvage the cars. As ever, qualifying began on Thursday in Monaco, but in the morning warm-up, Karl Wendlinger, keen to re-establish himself over teammate Frentzen, who'd out-qualified him so far, lost control coming out of the tunnel and slammed sideways into the barriers hard, with Karl's head ricocheting off the water containers. Quick on the scene as ever was Sid Watkins and the medical crews. Karl actually tried to get out of the car but quickly lost consciousness and was carefully extracted from the cockpit and sent off to Nice Hospital, where they found no skull fracture or spinal injury, thankfully, but a CT scan revealed a serious cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain, and he remained in a coma on life support. The Sauber team, unsure from the telemetry what had happened, stopped Frentzen from going back out, but the rest, grimly determined, continued while they waited for news of Wendlinger's condition. They got it in the afternoon after qualifying had finished. He was between life and death, and the next 48 hours would be critical. If he survived those, his prognosis was good, though the long-term effects were impossible to predict. He may never walk again, never mind race. With that news, Peter Sauber and Heinz-Harald Frentzen agreed that the team would withdraw from the race, unable to focus with their colleague in such a state. With no racing on Friday, the drivers, most of whom lived in Monaco, got together to officially form the GPDA and work out a list of demands. It was clear to all concerned that the cautious measures outlined by the FIA after Imola were not going to cut the mustard, whatever merits Mosley's words about not rushing things may have had. After voting, the 4 leaders chosen were Gerhard Berger, Niki Lauda, Michael Schumacher and Christian Fittipaldi, representing the more junior drivers. As well as most of the current field, Riccardo Patrese, Derek Warwick, Philippe Alliot and Alessandro Zanardi were also there to lend their experience. Max Mosley, Bernie Eccleston and the Automobile Club de Monaco president Michel Bouri held their own press conference in the meantime, announcing a raft of strong measures mostly aimed at slowing cars down, with a phased introduction. From the next race in Spain, the size of the rear diffusers and front wing end plates would be reduced and the front wing raised. From the following race in Canada, the car's airboxes would have holes cut in them to reduce the engine power, minimum weight increased by 25 kilos, and deformable head protectors installed. From Germany, the ride height would be increased, which would be enforced by means of a 10mm thick plank of wood attached to the underside of each car, with the plank inspected for wear at the end of the race, with a minimum of 1mm wear permitted. Downforce for 1995 would be reduced 50%, engines limited to 600 horsepower. There were some pretty major changes that teams were being asked to make in a matter of a few weeks. The drivers got together again and hammered out some demands of their own. They wanted to be included in discussions about rule changes, which Mosley agreed to, and would send drivers off to look at circuits with a view to recommending safety changes. Martin Brundle was given the job of doing this for Montreal. The 24 remaining drivers got back in their cockpits with a certain amount of trepidation, but satisfied that at least something was being done now. Derek Comas, who'd had a nasty crash at the Rascasse on Thursday and had announced he wouldn't be driving for the rest of the weekend, had been prevailed upon to change his mind and try again. His teammate Olivier Beretta, meanwhile, was making the good sort of local headlines, being the first Monegasque native to contest his home Grand Prix since André Testu in 1959, and the first to qualify for it since Louis Chiron brought his Works Lancia D50 home 6th in 1955. With just 24 cars now entered, a decision was taken to leave the front row of the grid empty as a tribute to Senna and Ratzenberger, and the Brazilian and Austrian flags would be painted on those grid positions before the race began. Michael Schumacher, who'd said before the race that he had been shaken after Imola and wasn't sure if he'd be able to go fast again, turned out to be able to go fast again, demolishing Nigel Mansell's lap record by over a second and a half on his way to the first pole position of his career, with the McLarens also going well. Brundle was second on Thursday, but it was Häkkinen making his first front row start after Martin suffered a collision and a diff failure to drop to 8th. The Ferraris were also still looking good, Berger 3rd and a lazy 5th on his return to the cockpit, sandwiching a nervous Damon Hill in 4th, struggling with oversteer. The footworks proved nimble on the tight streets and lined up 6th and 7th, but still had a fragile gearbox to overcome before they could be too optimistic. The Minardis were likewise looking good despite the handicap of a manual gear shift, with the Tyrrells next up. Comas was 13th, Beretta a career-best 18th for his home race, just ahead of Leto, whose recovery from his neck injury hadn't been helped by being rammed at Imola, and the Jordans well down the field. Rubens Barrichello still unable to concentrate properly after the death of his idol, and De Cesaris still getting the hang of the car on his 199th Grand Prix start. Herbert managed to drag his gripless Lotus up to 16th by throwing it around the place. Lamy, slightly more circumspect on his first trip to Monaco, was 20th, but still ahead of the demoralised Ligier squad, with David Brabham putting his lone Simtech, sporting the legend For Roland on top of the airbox, 24th ahead of the two Pacifics, who were 7.5 and 11.5 seconds adrift of pole after yet more engine failures and would never have got near a full grid. Saturday saw the traditional Monaco F3 race, won this year by 1993 Italian F3 runner-up Giancarlo Fisichella, leading home Germans Jörg Müller and Sascha Maassen, with Michael Schumacher's younger brother Ralph coming home 15th. With the morning warm-up done, Schumacher and Häkkinen fastest again, the drivers congregated half an hour before the start of the race for a minute's silence, with Christian Fittipaldi and Rubens Barrichello holding a banner with a portrait of Ayrton Senna and the motto Adeus Ayrton. Thoughts naturally were with Karl Wendlinger too, with news from Nice Hospital that having survived that crucial 48 hours the prognosis was better and he was now stable, but still in a coma and a serious condition. With that done, and with most teams looking at doing 2 pit stops despite the increased time needed for a stop with the new pit lane restrictions, the cars lined up for the start after the formation lap, with Lami's Lotus reluctant to get underway and starting from the back. With everyone fervently praying for a trouble-free race, the lights went green and away they went down to Saint-Devote. Schumacher got away well, but Hill got a great start in 4th to leap ahead of Berger, but as Häkkinen moved over to take the apex they touched and the McLaren spun into the barriers, while further back Martini and Morbidelli also touched and wound up in the barriers on the other side of the track. Hill made it round to Mirabeau before his front axle gave way, so that was 4 out on the first lap, and Schumacher had a 4-second lead over Berger already as he completed the lap, having seen 2 of his main rivals out already. Berger, for his part, was also leaving a lazy behind, and indeed the number 27 Ferrari was having to fend off Christian Fittipaldi's footwork, as Schumacher continued to stretch his lead over Berger by a dominant 2 seconds a lap, building up a nice lead for his first stop, and breaking Prost's 1993 lap record along the way. A short way behind Alesi and Fittipaldi were the Brundle brothers, reunited again, with Martin 5th in the McLaren and Mark 6th in the Tyrrell, and providing the best viewing on the track at that moment. Another man who'd got a good start was Andrea de Cesaris, and on lap 7 he moved up past Comas into 9th and started gaining on Alboreto in 8th. Comas, for his part, was now leading a little train of Herbert, another good starter, Barrichello, Beretta, Leto and Panis, with the camera mounted to the nose of Beretta's Larousse providing some great views of the back of Barrichello's Jordan. Schumacher knocked another second off the record and continued charging, making the gap back to Berger a whopping 13.6 seconds after 8 laps, and by lap 11 he was already lapping the Pacifics, the experienced Gaucho stepping neatly out of his way, which was a bit of an achievement given how difficult the PR01 was to steer. Alesi, meanwhile, had managed to lose Fittipaldi a little, and now Christian was having to look backwards at Martin Brundle, who had in turn left Blundell's Tyrrell to the tune of 4.5 seconds, with Katayama still 7th but a long way back in the second Tyrrell, and shortly to lose position to the 2 Italian veterans as Alboreto and de Cesaris came by on lap 16. The midfield scrap was now a 3-way, with Leto's camera watching Beretta and Barrichello in front, and Comas and Herbert having broken away, but soon enough on lap 18 JJ had his teammate behind and lapping 15th placed Panis and heading his way. Needless to say, Leto quickly let Schumacher through, and tucked up behind hoping to follow him past Beretta as they all came round to lap Belmondo. It took Leto a little longer to get past the Pacific, so when Beretta checked his mirrors he saw one Benetton behind, and with the marshals only showing him static blue flags, he continued defending his place, as he thought. Eventually Schumacher battered his way past at the Nouvelle chicane, and Beretta resumed his defensive driving, holding back the right Benetton this time. Even after all of that, Schumacher still led Berger by nearly 14 seconds, and it was now the Austrians' turn to approach that group, and then on lap 20 Martin Brundle was the first one in for a fuel and tyre stop, and the first to have to observe the new speed limit. Like all F1 cars, the McLaren didn't have a speedo on the dashboard, but they'd rigged up a light that would show if the revs went above those required for 80 kph. Others, like Williams, had set an actual rev limiter that a driver activated on hitting the pit lane. In any case, Brundle emerged just ahead of Alboreto's Minardi, who was keen to get past while the McLaren's tyres were still cool, but to no avail, so Martin kept 6th place and set off in pursuit of Blundell in 5th, and at the end of lap 23 Schumacher made his own stop. A slow getaway, but Berger pulled in right behind as he did so while the Ferrari stop was quicker, Schumacher held the lead, and Berger dropped to 4th behind Alesi and Fittipaldi. Leto came in, still from the back of that little group, followed by Katayama and Barrichello coming in simultaneously. The Tyrrell team spent 20 seconds fueling up the car to go the rest of the race, but the Hart engine on the Jordan behind him had died with an electrical fault, and that was Barrichello out, on lap 27, the first retirement since that pair of first corner incidents. Berger, meanwhile, had caught up to Ferrari, but was finding the light, nimble footwork just too much to get past despite his extra power, and the Austrian was all over the back of him, with Fittipaldi now gaining on Alesi again as he sped up to keep Berger behind. Most had assumed that Alesi and Fittipaldi were running one-stop strategies, but their stops when they came in together on lap 33 were both 10 seconds, so it seemed that they had both just been doing a long first stint. Emerging behind Berger and Brundle, they were now 4th and 5th, meaning that Brundle had been the big winner of the first round of stops, moving ahead of both of them overall. With that out of the way, the race settled down a bit as everyone dug in to wait for the next round of stops, with Bernard locking up and spinning into retirement on lap 36, and Schumacher still nearly 30 seconds ahead of Berger. Comas, with his now trademark sunglasses, stopped and took a while getting going again with a dodgy clutch. Katayama's long stop proved pointless as his gearbox gave up, and a couple of laps later Blundel's Yamaha detonated right in front of Schumacher, who nearly slid into the barriers at Saint-Devote on his oil. Berger was less lucky, though again he avoided the barriers, but had to go down the escape road and do a U-turn to get back moving again, rejoining just ahead of Brundle, who followed him up the hill and round the casino before going past at Mirabeau into second. Brundle sped off into the distance and left Berger behind very quickly, but was due in for his second stop soon, and duly came in on lap 45 with a 6-second gap, which of course meant he lost second, but still got out ahead of Alesi and Fittipaldi, still fighting their private battle over 4th and 5th. At least they were, until Jean got held up behind David Brabham. The cameras caught his fist wave, but missed him trying to go inside at lows and getting his nose trodden on. Jean came in for a new wing, but the Simtex rear axle had been damaged, and so David came in to retire. Jean's mood might have been lightened, though, if he'd seen Christian Fittipaldi following him in, the footwork succumbing to its fragile gearbox as well. And in a busy pit lane, Paul Belmondo pulled in with right leg cramps and stopped, had a bit of a breather, and got going again 5 laps later, and now 7 laps adrift, but it was important to the Pacific team just to get mileage under their belts. Schumacher made his second stop in the midst of all of that, a pitch-perfect 9.3 seconds, and back out, as Panis shot past slightly too close for comfort, with the gap back to second-place Berger now 12 seconds. Schumacher lapped De Cesaris, who'd made his way up to 4th on a one-stop strategy thanks to Alesi and Fittipaldi's troubles. Berger came in for a quicker stop than Schumacher's, but not quick enough to get him back out ahead of Brundle, though a 3-second gap was eminently achievable in the remaining 27 laps. Behind 4th place De Cesaris was Alesi in 5th, followed by Alboreto 6th, Leto 7th and Herbert 8th, and the latter two both came in on lap 54 and left in the same order. Schumacher continued lapping a good second or two faster than pretty much everyone else on the circuit, stretching his lead now to 37 seconds over Brundle, while both Ferraris were now charging, Berger chasing the McLaren, and Alesi eyeing De Cesaris' 4th place. Schumacher lapped Beretta with no troubles this time around, and indeed the local boy was driving well and reeling in Herbert, as pit lane reporter Derek Warwick, who seems to have borrowed a set of Jordan team overalls, had a quick chat with Mark Blundell. The cameras gave us a rare look at Alboretto's M193 as he was lapped by Brundle, with the team's new M194 chassis theoretically due to be introduced at the next race in Spain, but with the uncertainty over what redesigns might be needed, that might well change. Brundle for his part had pulled away from Berger again, the gap now 8 seconds. Belmondo, still cramping, decided to pull over on lap 62 before he hit something, which ended Pacific's weekend, Gasho's gearbox having given up the unequal struggle 5 laps earlier. Alesi was now right behind De Cesaris, who was being seriously held up by Olivier Beretta, who passed Herbert off-screen, and the Monegasque just didn't seem to want to let Andrea through, while Alesi watched from behind. For lap after lap, De Cesaris couldn't get through, and then when he did, Beretta proved an equal opportunities roadblock by holding up Alesi, but the Ferrari had a bit more grunt than the Jordan and forced his way past at the Nouvelle chicane, as Brundle was now appearing in his mirrors. This time the marshals remembered to wave some blue flags at Beretta, who got out of Martin's way. As the laps ticked down towards the end, Herbert clocked his first retirement of the year, while Lamy was still running but 6 laps down after having had to come in for repairs. Schumacher put another lap on Leto with 4 laps to go, only to let the Finn unlap himself shortly afterwards. Both of the Ferraris had backed right off by the end, Berger lapping so slowly that Olivier Panis nearly unlapped himself, and Alesi seemed content just to finish, with his neck getting ever more sore. So Schumacher followed Leto home to become the first German and first Benetton driver to win in Monaco, while Martin Brundle came in a very happy second and Berger was third, pulling over as soon as he crossed the line and peering at the back of his car. De Cesaris took 3 points for Jordan in 4th place, a reward for Eddie Jordan's faith in him, and doing no harm to his hopes of finding someone to let him have his 200th race sometime this year. A very sore Alesi came away with 2 points for 5th, and Alboreto picked up his first point of the season in 6th place, with Leto 7th for his first finish of the year. Beretta a fine 8th, even if he hadn't made a lot of friends out on track, for his first Grand Prix finish ever, with Panis, Comas and Lamy the final finishers. Schumacher leapt out of his car at Briatore as usual, But it was another subdued podium with no champagne, and Berger in particular looking pensive, another of his countrymen and friends now in hospital. So, 4 out of 4 so far for Michael Schumacher, leaving everyone else wondering where the opposition would come from in the keenly felt absence of Ayrton Senna. Much would depend on what regulation changes would be made during the season, and on the Monday morning after the race there was a meeting of team managers organised by Flavio Briatore, who wanted to halt or at least delay the FIA's plans for quick and dramatic changes. Frank Williams and Ron Dennis agreed with Briatore to threaten to boycott the Spanish Grand Prix if the changes weren't at least delayed, but among others, Jean Todt, Giancarlo Minardi and Ken Tyrrell all refused to join in, and the move quickly fell apart. Not that the dissenters necessarily agreed with the changes, of course, but they realised that if the teams were seen to be resisting them, they would be absolutely crucified by the media. So the rule changes due for the next race in Spain would go ahead at least. Smaller diffusers and front wing end plates, higher front wings, no anti-vortex fins, and speed bumps now at the pit lane entrance and exit. There would be a lot of midnight oil being burned by designers, mechanics and drivers testing the new cars over the next couple of weeks.